recognition that he was more than just an account number on a spreadsheet. Lisa was crying before Bobby finished explaining the notice, her voice breaking with frustration and helplessness because she'd tried everything, had exhausted every option, had called the bank 17 times in the last month and been transferred and put on hold and eventually disconnected, had written letters to the CEO and the board of directors and gotten no response, had contacted veteran advocacy groups and legal aid organizations and discovered that the system was designed to favor banks over borrowers, corporations over individuals, profit over people, and that fighting a foreclosure required resources and time and legal expertise that most people didn't have, that veterans especially didn't have because they'd spent their lives serving instead of accumulating wealth, protecting instead of profiting, sacrificing instead of saving. But Lisa had one more card to play, one connection she hadn't yet used because she'd been saving it for exactly this moment, for when all legal and official channels had been exhausted, and the only option left was the kind of help that operates outside the system, that comes from community rather than institutions, that relies on human solidarity rather than legal precedent. Her boyfriend Jake was a long-haul trucker, part of a network of drivers who monitored CB channels and social media groups, and maintained the kind of informal communication system that could mobilize resources and people faster than any official organization, that had proven time and again that when one of their own needed help, or when someone who deserved help called out, the response was immediate and overwhelming and unstoppable. Jake Ironroad. Morrison listened to Lisa's explanation with growing anger, his jaw clenching as she described the foreclosure notice, the 72-hour deadline, the bank's refusal to negotiate, the fact that Bobby Castellano was a decorated sergeant major with 3 Purple Hearts and a Bronze Star who'd served his country for 38 years and was now being thrown out of his house because he'd prioritized caring for his dying wife over making mortgage payments. Jake had never met Bobby, had no personal connection to him beyond Lisa, but he understood something fundamental about justice and injustice, about right and wrong, about the kind of situations that demand response rather than sympathy, action rather than outrage, mobilization rather than hand-wringing. Lisa, I need you to tell your dad not to pack anything, not to prepare to leave, not to accept that this foreclosure is happening. I'm making some calls, and by tomorrow morning that bank is going to understand that foreclosing on a war hero isn't a simple business transaction. It's a declaration of war, and they're about to discover that the trucking community doesn't lose wars. We don't surrender ground, and we sure as hell don't let decorated veterans get thrown out of their homes by bankers who have never sacrificed anything more significant than their lunch break. Tell him to sit tight. Tell him help is coming. Tell him that 72 hours is plenty of time for us to organize a response that will make this bank wish they'd shown some compassion when they had the chance. Jake's first call was to Marcus Ironhorse Sullivan, the unofficial leader of a nationwide network of truckers who'd been involved in dozens of similar interventions, who'd developed a reputation for responding to injustice with the kind of organized, disciplined, overwhelming force that came from military precision applied to civilian problems, from understanding that sometimes the only way to fight institutional power was with collective action, with the kind of solidarity that turns individual weakness into communal strength, that transforms scattered voices into a unified roar that can't be ignored, can't be dismissed, can't be defeated by lawyers and bureaucrats and the machinery of corporate indifference. Marcus listened too. Jake's explanation and was already pulling up maps and making calculations before Jake finished talking, because this was the kind of situation that activated every protective instinct he had, every sense of justice and fairness, and the fundamental belief that people who serve their country deserve better than to be discarded when they're no longer useful, deserve better than to have their homes stolen by institutions that privatize profits and socialize losses, deserve better than a system that bails out banks but forecloses on heroes, Jake, what's the name of the bank? Where's their main branch? How many entrances does the building have? Because I'm thinking we don't just show up and protest. We show up and shut them down. We make it physically impossible for them to conduct business until they reverse this foreclosure. We turn their building into a fortress that they can't enter and can't operate from, and we hold that position until they understand that this isn't negotiable, this isn't optional, this is happening. The plan came together with the kind of efficiency that comes from experience, from having done this before in different contexts, from understanding logistics and timing and the psychology of confrontation, from knowing that the key to successful direct action isn't violence or destruction, but presence and persistence, the ability to occupy space and hold ground and maintain discipline, while the other side realizes that their normal tools of power, their lawyers and security guards and police contacts, are useless against people who aren't breaking laws but are simply exercising their right to be present, to protest, to make their voices heard in ways that can't be ignored or dismissed or filed away in some bureaucratic drawer. Marcus made 17 calls in the next hour, reaching out to truckers across Georgia and neighboring states, explaining the situation with Bobby Castellano, providing details about First National Bank's main branch in downtown Columbus, outlining a plan that would require precision timing and absolute discipline, but would, if executed correctly, create a situation where the bank had no choice but to negotiate, no option but to reverse the foreclosure, no path forward except through the wall of steel and solidarity that would surround their building like a medieval siege. Except this siege wouldn't starve them out. It would shame them out, would force them to confront the human cost of their policies, would make them choose between their bottom line and their public image, between profit and decency, between business as usual and doing the right thing. And here's where I need you to understand the brilliance of what Marcus organized, because this wasn't just about blocking a building. This was about creating a spectacle that would force media attention, that would make the foreclosure a public issue rather than a private transaction, that would turn Bobby Castellano from an anonymous statistic into a human face that people could rally around, could identify with, could use as a symbol of everything wrong with a system that treats veterans as disposable, that values property rights over human rights, that allows banks to destroy lives with the same casual indifference they'd show to closing an account or denying a loan application. Hit that subscribe button right now, because you're about to witness something that shows the real power of organized community action, the way that ordinary people with trucks and determination and absolute commitment to justice can take on institutional power and win, can force change through presence rather than violence, can prove that the system isn't as immovable as it pretends to be when people decide they're not moving. They're not backing down. They're not accepting that this is how things have to be. The convoy began forming at 3 a.m. on Thursday morning, 72 hours before the foreclosure deadline, at a truck stop 15 miles outside Columbus, where drivers had been arriving throughout the night, coming from Atlanta and Birmingham and Nashville and Jacksonville, coming from as far as Texas and the Carolinas, abandoning routes and rescheduling deliveries, and explaining to dispatchers that they had an emergency that couldn't wait, a mission that took priority over freight and schedules, and the normal operations of their profession, because this was about something bigger than business, something more important than logistics, something that went to the core of who they were and what they believed about loyalty and service, and the obligations we owe to people who have protected us, who have sacrificed for us, who deserve our protection when they need it most. By 4 a.m., there were 43 trucks at the staging area. Their drivers gathered around Marcus's rig for a final briefing that emphasized discipline and nonviolence, that explained the legal boundaries they needed to stay within, that outlined the plan with military precision, because many of these drivers were veterans themselves, understood chain of command and mission objectives, and the importance of maintaining formation and following orders. understood that this operation would only succeed if everyone stayed calm and professional, and absolutely committed to the goal of forcing the bank to reverse the foreclosure, without giving them any excuse to claim the truckers were the aggressors, were breaking laws, were doing anything except exercising their constitutional rights to protest and petition for redress of grievances. "Listen up," Marcus said, his voice carrying across the parking lot in the pre-dawn darkness. "We roll out at 4:30 and we arrive at the bank at exactly 5 a.m., before their security arrives, before their employees show up, before they have any chance to prepare or respond or block us from taking position. We're going to surround that building with trucks, one at each entrance and exit. Close enough that nothing gets in or out, but far enough that we're on public streets, and not on their property, legal and clean, and absolutely unassailable from a law enforcement perspective. We stay in our trucks, we keep our engines running, we monitor CB Channel 19 for coordination, and we hold position until the bank agrees to meet with Bobby Castellan and negotiate a solution that lets him keep his house. This is not a negotiation on our part. This is not a request, this is a siege, and we hold until they surrender." The convoy rolled out at 4:32 a.m., 43 18-wheelers moving through the darkness like a mechanized army, their running lights creating a river of illumination on the empty highways, their CB radios crackling with position reports and confirmations, and the kind of focused communication that comes from people executing a complex operation with multiple moving parts and zero margin for error. They entered Columbus from 3 different directions, converging on downtown with the precision of a military operation, and at exactly 5:03 a.m., they took their positions around First National Bank's main branch, a gleaming glass and steel building that occupied an entire city block and now found itself surrounded by trucks, hemmed in by chrome and diesel, and the immovable presence of people who decided that this foreclosure wasn't happening, that this veteran wasn't losing his home, that this bank was going to learn a lesson about the consequences of treating heroes like numbers. 10 trucks blocked the main entrances, positioned bumper to bumper in a line that made it impossible for vehicles to enter or exit the parking garage, impossible for employees to drive to work, impossible for the bank to operate normally. Another 15 trucks surrounded the building on the public streets, their presence creating a visual barrier that announced to anyone passing by that something significant was happening here, that this wasn't business as usual, that the bank was under siege. The remaining 18 trucks were held in reserve at strategic positions around downtown, ready to reinforce any position that needed support, ready to respond to any attempt by the bank to break the blockade, ready to maintain the siege for as long as it took, because these drivers had committed to staying, had arranged for relief drivers and supply runs and the kind of logistical support that would allow them to hold position for days if necessary, for weeks if that's what justice required. The first bank employee arrived at 6:15 a.m., a security guard who pulled up to the parking garage entrance and found his way blocked by a Peterbilt 389 that wasn't moving, wasn't negotiating, was just sitting there with its engine idling and its driver, a woman named Sarah, Mama Bear Chen, calmly explaining that the bank was closed today due to a labor action, that he should go home and wait for further instructions, that his employers had made some very poor decisions, and were now facing the consequences of those decisions in the form of a complete operational shutdown, until they agreed to do the right thing regarding Sergeant Major Robert Castellano's foreclosure. The security guard called his supervisor, who called the bank's operations manager, who called the CEO, and within an hour the bank's executive team was gathered in an emergency meeting trying to figure out how to respond to a situation they'd never encountered before, had never prepared for, had never imagined was possible, because banks don't get blockaded. Banks don't get sieged. Banks operate with the assumption that their power is absolute and their decisions are final, and that individual borrowers, especially ones who are behind on payments, have no recourse except to accept their fate and move on. But they'd never dealt with. The trucking community had never encountered the kind of organized solidarity that could mobilize 43 trucks overnight, had never faced people who understood that sometimes the only way to fight institutional power is with collective action that makes normal operations impossible, that forces negotiation through disruption rather than through legal channels that are rigged in favor of the powerful. By 8 a.m. the media had arrived, news vans from every local station and several national outlets that had picked up the story from social media, where images of the truck blockade were going viral, where the hashtag #StandWithBobby was trending, where people across the country were sharing the story of a decorated war hero being foreclosed on by a bank that had received billions in bailout money during the 2008 financial crisis, that had been saved by taxpayer dollars and was now showing zero compassion for a taxpayer who'd served his country for 38 years and was asking for a little flexibility, a little understanding, a little recognition that he was more than just a delinquent account. Marcus gave interviews from the cab of his truck, explaining the situation with the kind of calm authority that made it clear this wasn't a spontaneous protest, but a carefully planned operation, that the truckers weren't leaving until the foreclosure was reversed, that they were prepared to hold this position for as long as necessary because Sergeant Major Castellano had held positions under enemy fire in Vietnam, and these truckers weren't about to show less courage or commitment than he had, weren't about to surrender ground that he'd earned through his service and sacrifice, weren't about to let a bank take from him what he'd paid for with blood and years, and the kind of dedication that most people, especially most bankers, couldn't begin to comprehend. Bobby Castellano himself arrived at 9 a.m., driven downtown by his daughter Lisa and her boyfriend Jake, and when he saw the trucks surrounding the bank, when he understood what these strangers had done for him, this decorated sergeant major who'd commanded men in combat and maintained his composure under fire broke down and cried, overwhelmed by the knowledge that he wasn't alone, that his service had been recognized and honored not by the government or the bank, but by ordinary working people who decided that his fight was their fight, that his home was worth defending, that his dignity and his sacrifice, and his right to live out his remaining years in the house where he'd raised his family were non-negotiable, were worth fighting for, were worth disrupting business and risking arrest, and standing up to institutional power that seemed invincible until people decided it wasn't, until people decided that enough was enough and this was the line they wouldn't let be crossed. The truckers emerged from their cabs when Bobby arrived, forming an honor guard that lined the sidewalk, and Marcus Ironhorse Sullivan stepped forward and saluted with the crisp precision of his Marine Corps training, holding that salute until Bobby returned it with shaking hands and tears streaming down his weathered face. "Sergeant Major, we're here because what's happening to you is wrong, is unjust, is unacceptable in a country that claims to value military service and sacrifice. We're here because you held the line in Vietnam, and we're going to hold the line here in Columbus. We're here because your home is worth defending, and we're the ones who showed up to defend it. And we're not leaving, sir. We're not backing down. We're not surrendering this ground until that bank reverses your foreclosure and gives you the modification you should have received months ago when you first asked for help." The standoff continued throughout the morning, the bank unable to operate with trucks blocking every entrance, their employees unable to reach their offices, their ATMs inaccessible, their drive-through lanes blocked, their entire operation shut down by the simple presence of trucks that weren't breaking any laws but were making it impossible for business to continue as usual. The CEO, a man named Richard Thornton who'd been with First National for 30 years and had overseen the foreclosure of thousands of homes without losing a minute of sleep, found himself in an impossible situation, where every option was bad, where calling the police would create a public relations nightmare because you can't arrest people for parking legally on public streets, where trying to force the issue would make him look like a villain attacking veterans and working-class heroes, where doing nothing meant losing millions in daily operations and looking weak and ineffective to his board of directors and shareholders. By noon, Thornton had made the calculation that any competent executive would make. That the cost of reversing one foreclosure was infinitely smaller than the cost of this siege continuing, that the public relations damage was already significant and would only get worse the longer this went on, that the story was now national news, and every hour of continued blockade was another hour of the bank being portrayed as heartless and greedy and anti-veteran, another hour of damage to their brand and their reputation, and their ability to attract customers who didn't want to do business with a bank that throws war heroes out of their homes. He called his lawyers, who confirmed what he already knew, that the truckers weren't breaking any laws, that there was no legal mechanism to force them to move, that the only solution was negotiation and compromise, and giving Bobby Castellano what he should have been given in the first place. The meeting happened at 1 p.m. in a conference room at a nearby hotel. Bobby Castellano and his daughter Lisa on one side of the table, Richard Thornton and two bank lawyers on the other, and Marcus Ironhorse Sullivan sitting in as Bobby's advocate and witness. His presence a reminder that this negotiation was happening under duress, that the bank's position had been compromised by the truck blockade, that they were negotiating from weakness rather than strength, and that the terms would reflect that reality. Thornton opened with an offer that was insulting in its inadequacy, a 6-month forbearance that would just delay the foreclosure rather than prevent it, that would add fees and interest and leave Bobby in an even worse position than he was now. Marcus leaned forward, his voice quiet but carrying the kind of authority that comes from knowing you hold all the cards, from understanding that the other side has no leverage and no options except to accept your terms or watch their business remain shut down indefinitely. Mr. Thornton, let me explain how this is going to work. You're going to forgive the 4 missed payments. You're going to modify Sergeant Major Castellano's loan to reflect his current income and ability to pay. You're going to remove all late fees and penalties. And you're going to put in writing that this foreclosure is permanently canceled and that his home is secure for as long as he wants to live there. And you're going to do all of this in the next 2 hours, because at 3 p.m. I'm calling in another 50 trucks from across the Southeast. And this blockade is going to expand to include every First National branch in Georgia. And tomorrow it's going to include every branch in the Southeast. And by next week, your entire operation is going to be shut down unless you do the right thing right now today in this room. Thornton looked at his lawyers who nodded reluctantly because they understood that Marcus wasn't bluffing, that the trucking community had the numbers and the organization and the commitment to do exactly what he was threatening, that this situation could escalate from a local problem to a regional crisis to a national catastrophe for the bank's operations and reputation, that the only rational choice was to give Bobby Castellano what he was asking for and end this siege before it destroyed everything the bank had built over decades of operation. Fine, we'll modify the loan, forgive the missed payments, cancel the foreclosure. But I want those trucks gone by 5 p.m. today. I want a public statement from your group acknowledging that we negotiated in good faith, and I want assurances that this kind of action won't be taken against our bank in the future. Marcus smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone who'd won a battle and wanted the defeated to understand the terms of their surrender. Mr. Thornton, the trucks will leave when the paperwork is signed and Sergeant Major Castellano confirms that the terms are acceptable. As for future actions, I can't make any promises because that depends entirely on whether your bank learns from this experience, whether you start treating veterans and struggling borrowers with the compassion and flexibility they deserve, whether you remember that you're dealing with human beings and not just account numbers. You treat people right, you won't see us again. You foreclose on another veteran, you refuse to work with another family in crisis. You prioritize profits over people one more time, and we'll be back. And next time we won't be negotiating. We'll just be shutting you down until you change your policies permanently. The paperwork was signed at 2:47 p.m. Bobby Castellano's foreclosure officially canceled, his loan modified to payments he could afford, his home secured for as long as he lived. And when Marcus called the truckers on CB Channel 19 to announce that the mission was accomplished, that the siege was over, that they'd won, the air horns that sounded across downtown Columbus were like a victory celebration, like the bells that ring when a war is won, like the sound of justice being served through solidarity and courage, and the absolute refusal to accept that institutional power is stronger than collective action, that banks are more powerful than communities, that money matters more than honor and service, and the fundamental human right to have a place to call home. The trucks pulled away from First National Bank at 3:15 p.m., their blockade lifted, their mission complete, but their presence had changed something fundamental in Columbus and beyond, had proven that veterans don't have to face foreclosure alone, that communities can organize to protect their own, that banks aren't invincible when people decide to fight back, that sometimes the most effective protest isn't marching or chanting, but simply being present, occupying space, making normal operations impossible until justice is served and wrongs are righted, and the powerful are forced to remember that their power exists only as long as the rest of us allow it to exist, only as long as we accept their decisions as final, only as long as we believe that we're powerless to change systems that seem designed to crush us. And somewhere in Columbus, Georgia, in a 3-bedroom ranch house that almost became another foreclosure statistic, another data point in the ongoing crisis of veteran homelessness and financial instability, Sergeant Major Robert Bobby Castellano sits on his porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over the yard where his kids played and his wife gardened, and his life unfolded across decades of service and sacrifice and ordinary human struggle. And he thinks about the morning he woke up to find 43 trucks surrounding a bank, thinks about the strangers who became family, thinks about the community that showed up when institutions failed, thinks about the proof that we're not alone in this world as long as we remember that we're all connected, all responsible for each other, all obligated to stand up when someone needs help, to show up when justice demands presence, to be the answer to someone's prayer for deliverance, for protection, for the simple recognition that their life matters, their service matters, their home matters, and that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is park our trucks and refuse to move until the world acknowledges that truth, until the powerful bend to the will of the people, until justice is served not through courts or laws, but through the unstoppable force of ordinary people who decide that enough is enough, and this is where we make our stand. Bank tried foreclosing war hero's house. At dawn, 10 semi-trucks blocked every entrance to the building. The foreclosure notice arrived at 8:47 a.m. on a Monday morning in February, delivered by a process server who couldn't meet Sergeant Major Robert Bobby Castellano's eyes as he handed over the envelope that contained the legal death sentence for everything Bobby had built in his 63 years of living, 42 years of marriage, and 38 years of military service. The notice gave him 72 hours to vacate the property, 72 hours to pack up a lifetime of memories and medals and photographs, 72 hours to surrender the 3-bedroom ranch house in Columbus, Georgia that he'd bought with his VA loan in 1987, where he'd raised 4 kids, where his wife Maria had died of Alzheimer's 2 years ago, where every room held ghosts of better days, and the walls themselves seemed to whisper the story of a family that had loved and struggled and survived until the bank decided that survival wasn't profitable enough, that the missed mortgage payments during Maria's final illness were unforgivable, that a decorated war hero's service and sacrifice meant nothing compared to the bottom line of First National Bank's quarterly earnings report. Bobby read the notice 3 times, his hands shaking not with fear but with rage, with the kind of fury that comes from playing by the rules your entire life, only to discover that the rules don't apply equally, That banks get bailouts when they fail, but veterans get foreclosures when they stumble. That the same country he'd bled for in Vietnam and served in a dozen other deployments had created a system where missing 4 mortgage payments while caring for a dying wife could cost you everything, could erase decades of equity and investment, and the fundamental promise that if you work hard and serve honorably and do everything right, you'll have a place to call home, a piece of ground that's yours, a sanctuary that can't be taken away by bureaucrats and bankers who have never worn a uniform or made a sacrifice, or understood what it means to put your life on the line for something bigger than yourself. He called his daughter Lisa first, the oldest of his 4 children, a nurse in Atlanta who'd been helping him navigate the financial chaos of Maria's final years, who'd been trying to negotiate with the bank for months, who'd submitted hardship applications and requested modifications, and provided documentation of Bobby's military service and his wife's medical expenses and the temporary nature of his financial difficulties, all of which had been met with form letters and bureaucratic indifference, and the cold calculation that it was more profitable to foreclose and resell than to work with a veteran who'd given everything to his country and was asking for a little flexibility, a little compassion, a little